I'm going to start today by talking about the Big Bang, Big Crunch theory of Islamic society. This is a notion that I have devised to try and help people to keep track of some very broad themes in Islamic history, and to suggest something that is very striking and I think unique in the Islamic religion. Clearly, if I use the term Big Bang, Big Crunch, I'm using something borrowed from cosmology, from the idea that the universe began with a singularity, and in that singularity was embedded everything that could ever be in the physical universe. The Big Crunch is the idea that as the universe expands in this phenomenal way after the singularity, at some point it gets drawn back together again. And it comes back together under the force of gravity in a big crunch, and out of that a new singularity emerges, and then the universe expands once again, a new universe. Okay, if you're going to take this as an analogy and apply it to Islam, then the singularity you start with is down here, and it's the Quran. God says to Muhammad, recite, and what is recited in the revelations that are brought together after Muhammad's death in the Quran contains all that can ever be about Islam. There was nothing else except the recitation. After that, you have an expansion that I'm saying is analogous to what you have in cosmology. That is to say, you have a single point in the Quran where Islam is there. And then it expands and it becomes diverse. Now that expansion takes the form of the spread of the reports on the words of the Prophet and the actions of the Prophet in those moments when he was not receiving revelation. And each of these reports is called a Hadith. A Hadith, the plural incidentally is ahadith because Arabic has bizarre plurals. A Hadith is a report that is preceded by a chain of narrators, so that in that chain, the person that, let us say you as a student, hear a report from, it is I heard it from A, who heard it from B, who heard it from C, who heard it from D, who heard it from the messenger of God. So that oral string of authorities is called an isnad. We don't know how many hadith came into circulation. We have maybe 20,000 today that are contained in 6 books that are regarded as the authoritative hadith. But it seems fairly clear that there must have been over 100,000 reports in circulation at an earlier point. Now, when I say in circulation, it gets into the question of how did these reports get reported? We do not have an existing written form of hadith going back into the 1st century of Islam. Instead, we have oral tradition. In that oral tradition, there is room for skepticism, of the sort that Professor Kamali talked about last week. And there is a school of thought that maintains that all of the Hadith, this 100,000 plus collection of reports, were contrived maybe 200 years after the lifetime of the Prophet. And then the isnads were invented in order to root the report in the lifetime of the Prophet. This idea was particularly associated with the name of a Columbia professor, Joseph Schacht. And Schacht's argument was that when Islamic law starts to become a subject of specific interest and writing, it's about 200 years after the Prophet. And the law has many of its strictures, many of its ideas drawn from Hadith. So Schacht and those who followed him argued that the Hadith were invented in order to service the interests of the lawyers who were trying to bring some sort of legal system to the growing Muslim community. There are examples that he would give that would seem to fit that kind of scenario. But the fact of the matter is that in the 6 books that later became canonized as the most authoritative hadith, although, as I say, nobody can prove any single hadith went back to the Prophet in terms of a written text. But of those 6 books, the great majority of the hadith that they contain relate to issues of practice. How do you pray? How do you perform your ablutions? How do you wash yourself before prayer? If you fast during the month of Ramadan, as you should, what are the limits on fasting? How do you fast? What does a fast constitute? If you make the pilgrimage to Mecca, what are the rules that will affect your making the pilgrimage? In other words, the things that are associated with the 5 pillars of Islam. Those pillars being the profession of faith, that is, say, the statement that there is no God but God and Muhammad is the messenger of God. Then you have fasting during the month of Ramadan, prayer 5 times a day, payment of a annual tax called a zakat, and making the pilgrimage at least once during your lifetime if you are financially able, the Hajj. So these topics make up most of the content of the 6 books of canonical hadith. It's very hard to see any legal purpose in most of these things. For example, a dog is considered ritually unclean in Islam, and so is a pig. So if you have to perform your ablutions before prayer in order to put yourself in a state of ritual purity, and you have a basin of water, what do you do if a dog or a pig was seen drinking from the basin? Well, if it is a pig, you throw out the water because the water is polluted by the saliva of the pig. If it is a dog, you throw out the water and you break the bowl because the dog's saliva is more polluting than the pig's saliva. Now, some people have have argued that this is simply picking up traditions from Judaism relating to the uncleanness of pigs. But as one of my students who wrote a doctoral dissertation on this subject wrote in his thesis, he said, here's what you have to do if a pig or a dog has drunk from the basin because the saliva is polluting. Then he said, but I, as an Orthodox practicing Jew, can French kiss a pig and immediately say my prayers. Now I thought the image of French kissing a pig in a doctoral thesis at Columbia warranted the granting of the degree in and of itself. But the fact of the matter was that while there are certain dietary elements that are the same between Islam and Judaism, the purity elements are quite different. So in other words, if you are praying as a Muslim and you get a bloody nose and some blood drops on your shirt, you stop your prayers, you change your shirt, you perform ablutions again, and you start over because blood is polluting. It's not just that you can't eat it, but it's also polluting. On the other hand, again, to take the example of my student who now teaches at religiously conservative Bar Ilan University in Israel, he said, as a combat medic, I can literally be covered in blood and say my prayers, because I can't eat blood, but blood is not polluting if it gets on me or on my clothing. So, and in fact, the blood of a red heifer is used to purify the temple in Jerusalem. So it's not, as many people have suggested, that you have a melding of Jewish practice with Muslim practice. They're really quite distinct in their, at a conceptual level, in particulars like that. And this is sort of detail you will get in Hadith. Nothing in the Quran will tell you about pig saliva. But you will find that out in the Hadith. These particulars have very little to do with things that we normally think of as law. They have to do with how you live your Islam. So the hadith that were in circulation in any given community came to be added to the Quran as guides as to what Islam is. Now, if all of the hadith had come into circulation at the same point, then you might have a clear notion of what Islam was or what Islam should be in terms of the hadith. But they did not come into circulation at the same point. Different communities have different collections of hadith. So you can find a community where a subject will be explored in detail in the hadith, and most of those hadith will later be discarded because they don't fit the criteria that are developed for deciding what is a sound hadith or an unsound hadith. But an even better indication of the geographical distinctiveness of collections of hadith is that for, let's say, for at least 300 years, it was the practice for those Muslims who wanted to become knowledgeable about the faith to travel in search of hadith. Rihla fi talab al-hadith, travel in search of hadith. This became kind of the curriculum vitae for scholars of Islam. When you read about these individual scholars, and we have thousands of very terse biographical notions, many of those biographical notes talk about where did the person study. And he travels from here to there, to someplace else, often for years, and collects hadith in each place he stops. Now, if you collect those travel accounts, and they're just, it'll just say, he heard hadith in Baghdad, Kufa, Basra, Nishapur, and Medina. It'll just be a list of places. But if you go to an individual location and look at the travel notes that have survived from that location, you'll find that people in one city would tend to have a certain itinerary, and people in a city that might not even be very far away might have quite a different itinerary. So if when I studied the city of Nishapur in northeastern Iran, I later studied the city of Gorgan, also in northeastern Iran. The travel itineraries of the scholars were quite different. So that in Gorgan, at the southeastern tip of the Caspian Sea, many people went to Yemen. In Nishapur, not so many. But many people in Nishapur went to Central Asia. What they did was go to a place, find out who the most eminent reciter of hadith was, and then sit and take down verbatim the hadith that he recited. So the result was that in Nishapur you would have thousands of hadith that were known, but they wouldn't be the same hadith that they had in Gorgan. And certainly not the same hadith that they had in Cairo. Well, Cairo wasn't built yet, let's say in Fustat in Egypt. And certainly not the same hadith that they had in North Africa or in Spain. So over the entire extent of the empire that was created as a result of the Arab conquests, you had a circulation of hadith that was uneven. And in a way, this is a little bit like what happens after the Big Bang, in the sense that you have a spreading of energy through a universe, but it is differently expressed or developed in different areas. So you have a galaxy here, a galaxy there, this galaxy isn't like that galaxy, and then these planets aren't like that planets, these stars aren't like these stars. So you have an expansion that embodies a tremendous amount of diversity. So the hadith become a vehicle for diversity. One of the reasons that this works, or rather that it developed this way, is that it was understood or agreed upon, let's say, that anyone who had lived at the time of the prophet and who saw him or spoke to him had some degree of qualification to tell stories about him. So when you had a conquest, and by the year 711, Spain is conquered in the west, and the lower part of Pakistan, the province of Sindh, is conquered in the east. In other words, you have an enormous empire that is conquered between 634 and 711. Very brief time. You have Arabs who have gone in the military, and sometimes just as migrants, into this conquest area. And during that first period, the first 70 years after the prophet's death, first 50 years, let's say, many of these people had seen Muhammad. They'd been in Medina. They might not have seen much of him. They might not have personally talked to him. But if they said, I asked the messenger of God the following, and he said, that's a legitimate hadith. So the reason this happens is that as people go into the conquest area, those who are coming from Medina itself sort of know the practice of the community. But as time goes on, more and more local people hear about Islam, and they want to know something about it. Well, who do they go to? We don't have any written text to go to. Sure, they could go to the Quran if they could find someone who had memorized the Quran, or very rarely who actually had a written text of the Quran. But the Quran wouldn't answer the question like, what happens if my nose bleeds in the midst of my prayer? Who's going to answer that question? It's not in the Quran. So you might get one answer in Spain and one answer in Central Asia. The proof that you have different places where hadith come into circulation, as I say, goes back to these itineraries that the scholars would follow collecting hadith. They expected to find different hadith in different places. I'm stressing this because people who follow Joseph Schacht have argued that all of the hadith began in Iraq, because that's where Islamic law was first widely debated and discussed. But if they all started in Iraq, then the later scholars would all go to Iraq to find, what was the sort of the ur source of all of these hadith. But they didn't go to Iraq. They did, but not necessarily. They went other places as well. So you had hundreds of people who were saying things about what the Prophet did and what the Prophet said. Were they all telling truthful things? Or did you have people who were asked a question about the faith and they knew what they did, but they didn't necessarily know why they did it, but they wanted to root what they knew in the origin of the faith. So they said, the Prophet said such and such. I once angered a colleague at Berkeley by mentioning in class that he had told a student that he could borrow a book from his library, but that he would be in dire straits if he did not return the book, because there was a hadith prohibiting you from borrowing a book from a professor and not returning it. And this was not a hadith. It was his way of trying to emphasize how deeply he felt about his library. But then he said I was trivializing hadith by mentioning the story, but I don't think I was, because so many of the hadith probably originated just that way. Somebody is asked a question, and someone answers the question, and in order to make their answer seem authoritative, they root it in the practice or the words of the Prophet. When you look at what was happening, let us say, in the late 700s and in the 800s, it appears as though Islam is beginning to come apart. Different notions of what the faith is are becoming circulated in different communities. Something similar happened in Christianity, and this was the reason Christianity created a church, so that you had a hierarchy of authority, so that people knew who to turn to. In other words, you didn't just go to someone who said that something that they had heard that Jesus did. You went to a priest, who in turn was appointed by a bishop, who in turn was responsible to a pope or a patriarch. And this way you kept the lore of the faith under some degree of control. But in the absence of a church structure, this explosive dissemination of lore about the Prophet really ran the risk of moving the faith in different directions in different places. What prevented this from happening was a practice that grew up in the late 800s and came to fruition in the 900s of studying the isnads. If A heard it from B, or heard it from C, or heard it from D, then did A learn something before B died? Is that a real connection? Or if A is from Samarkand and B is from Baghdad, do we have any idea that A went to Baghdad and heard from B? The science of isnads led to a wholesale renunciation of the validity of a tremendous number of hadith. They came to be considered da'if, or weak, whereas one that had a sound isnad was sahih, or sound. The winnowing of the corpus of hadith by a handful of specialists of this sort is what produces the 6 canonical books of hadith that the Sunni world relies on today for their notion of what the community was like in its first 200 years. Now, those 6 books, let us say they're available in the 900s, but people are still individually traveling and collecting hadith 300 years later, and the books don't really become completely accepted as the only reliable hadith until maybe the 1300s. So, this canonization process, in other words, does not take place as soon as the books are completed. It takes place very gradually. And it's a very awkward process. There were people who specialized in rare hadith, gharib al-hadith. They wanted the ones that were the least known. Well, the ones that were least known were the ones most likely to be considered weak, because the technique of these isnad students was to say, if we have a saying of the Prophet that we collect here in Samarkand, and another one we collect in Baghdad, another one in Medina, and another one in Damascus, and they all have the same wording, but different isnads, then the probability is that this really is something the Prophet said. Because how could we explain 4 completely different isnads in geographically dispersed locations? So the result is that those hadith that were the rarest were the most likely to be discarded. And this, in many communities, was extremely troubling, because sometimes your most famous scholar would be famous because he knew rare hadith. Now, the reason for knowing rare hadith was obviously to set yourself apart from the other people who were collecting hadith. But it also had to do with the isnad itself. If you have an oral tradition where you were transmitting a few words verbatim from generation to generation to generation, the probability of error increases with every iteration. So the most likely sound hadith is the one that has the fewest steps between your collector and the Prophet. And this is what is known as having a high isnad. So there are many people who thought that in addition to having rare hadith, it was important to have a high isnad for the hadith. That is to say, to have as few steps as possible between you and the Prophet. You might travel a very long distance in order to secure this. This had a curious consequence. it meant that there was a very high premium put on having very old people teaching very young people. Now we have a cultural quirk that says that 35-year-olds should teach 20-year-olds, and anyone over 50 doesn't know anything and can't learn, and anyone under 15 has, either too many hormones to learn anything, or they're a child, and who cares? So we have concentrated our notion of learning into the center of the age table, so that we have the not very old ideally teaching the not very young. Whereas in Islamic society, the tradition was that the very old teach the very young. This can be quantified. I published a study of age parameters of medieval Islamic education that indicated that the typical literate person who had time to go to classes instead of, his regular job of, operating a soap factory or something like that, that he would start, and I'm saying he here specifically because we have very little evidence of women in open classes. Women did study, but they most often studied with their male relatives rather than an open class. But a person would start going to class around the age of 7. Continue going to class until 18 or so. In other words, this is pretty much the same from first grade to college. When people traveled, they might travel when they were young if they traveled with their father or their uncle or someone. But they're more likely to go off traveling in their late teens and travel into their early 20s. And it was during this time period that they are collecting Hadith wherever they go. In a large city, in any given point in time, you would appear to, and by a large city I'm talking, let's say a city over 100 or 150,000, you might have a dozen prominent reciters of Hadith. There are hundreds others who could recite Hadith, but they don't because the ones who are reciting it are older or have a higher isnad or have rarer Hadith. So of those people who study Hadith, only a very small percentage ever teach Hadith to anyone outside their family. The time gap between completing your studies in the sense of taking precise notes of the Hadith you hear and beginning to teach is between, let's say, 15 and 30 years. So this isn't something where you go to class and you learn it and then 3 years later you hand in your thesis and now you start teaching and pilfering the notes from your professor. This is a matter that you've acquired a body of lore, and now there's a big gap when you marry, you have children, you have a business, and then later in life you start to recite Hadith. Now you start to recite Hadith because you are getting old and people think of you as someone who has who will give them a high isnad if they have their son go and study with you. Or, under certain circumstances, you're the last living student of someone. And so people will come to study with you. One of the most important scholars, important because he made one of these collections of Hadith that subsequently became canonical. His name is Bukhari, from Bukhara in present-day Uzbekistan. Al-Bukhari had a number of people that he recited his collection to, and then they recited the collection to other people. But at a certain point, not one of his direct students, but one of the students in the next generation, a man named Kushmayhani, who lived in a little village in what is now Turkmenistan, he appears to have been the only surviving student in that tier. And so people would come from all over to study under Kushmayhani because it would give them a higher isnad. All right, this is kind of tedious, I realize, but it's terribly important for understanding where the practices of the Muslim community come from. Once the big collections of canonical hadith are formed, gradually it became less and less valuable or less and less legitimate to collect a hadith from an individual. People quit collecting rare hadith. They quit collecting, it's specialists. Like, I know of a man, he collected hadith only recited from a certain companion of the Prophet. And then God appeared to him in a dream and said, "Now stop collecting X and start collecting Y." So he quit collecting X and he started collecting Y, a little bit like, stamp collectors who only do British colonies or something like that. But that kind of specialization gradually dies out. And instead you have the generalization of these 6 books. Now, the interesting thing about the collection of the 6 books is that they are organized by subject matter. It might not be impossible to figure out the geography of the hadith in the 6 books, but no one has done it. In other words, it might be possible to say, okay, here's a stratum that comes in from Afghanistan, or here's a stratum that comes in from Tunisia. But instead, by organizing it by topic, it eliminates any notion of geographical specificity. So the result is that Islam, which was beginning to come apart because of the spread of hadith, now comes back together again. And so if the Quran is the content of the first singularity, when it comes back together again, you have the Quran and the Sunnah. The Sunnah is the term that we give to the practices that are validated by the hadith collections. Part of the Sunnah obviously can be rooted in the Quran, but many of the aspects of the Sunnah are carried in the hadith collections. So what this does is that after an expansion, now you have the big crunch. Islam is coming together again. It's just that instead of it being the Quran, that is everything that Islam is or can be, now it's the Quran and the Sunnah together that are everything that Islam can be. Now, even though it's not a precise chronological fit, because it's about a century or century and a half later than this beginning of the consolidation of hadith, you have a second expansion. And this has to do precisely in the area of law. You have individual legal thinkers who propagate among their students specific ideas about what is the law. Now, how do we adjudicate something in Islam? Now, historians have been able to go through and count something like 25 different so-called schools of law. They're called schools of law, but they weren't schools in the physical sense. And the word madhab, which is used for law school, really means the point of departure. And the point of departure does not have a physical locus. We can identify where the major people who promulgated these ideas on the law, we can say where they lived, but they're the people who follow them may be anywhere. It's a dispersal, so that you can have people in Baghdad will have, say, 2 competing schools of law as for most of the population, but will have, a half dozen others for other elements of the population. People in Spain might have a quite different array, or people in Central Asia. And the notion of law was a complicated one. It had basically two notions. One of them called the usul, and the other called the furu'. Usul is the plural of a word for root in Arabic. And so the usul are the sources of the law and how those sources are to be understood. The furu' are the branches or the twigs, the applications of the law. Most of the debate back in the late 700s and the 800s was on the issue of the usul. But the application of the law, the furu', over time becomes a contested area as well. Now, the reason this is conceptually subsequent to the Hadith is that the Hadith come to be thought of as one of the usul, one of the sources of the law. So you can't, the Quran is the first source. The Hadith is, for most people, the second source. Then you have 2 other sources. One is a type of logic called qiyas, and the other is consensus, or ijma'. The idea that the Hadith would be a source of law assumes that the Hadith exists before the law exists. And this gets into the question of how did law originate in Islam? There are many people who talk about Islamic law as being synonymous with Islam. They say, well, Islam is a system of law. But that is something that develops historically. And just as you have to recognize that the Sunnah is something that develops historically and undergoes changes in this process of determining what is sahih and what is da'if, so with the law you have to recognize that this is a historical development. The Quran says, obey God and His messenger and those who are put in command over you. Then there are various verses in the Quran that apply to specific things. Most of the verses apply to that are thought of as being legal verses, apply to things like marriage, inheritance, divorce, and so on. In other words, it's a personal status thing. Very little in the Quran applies to criminal law, what we would call criminal law, or to commercial law, or to constitutional law, the nature of government. There are 5 offenses in the Quran that are regarded as offenses for which someone can be killed, and that's pretty much it for the criminal law. And over the centuries, criminal law has been primarily the affair of the state, with often rather tenuous links into Quranic verse, although there are hadith that will support certain interpretations within criminal law. The idea that's common in this country that Islamic law is primarily about cutting off hands or cutting off heads bears so little relationship to Islamic law that it's not even worth pointing out the idiocy of most of the things written about Islamic law. You know, well, in the city here in Texas, we don't permit any Sharia. Yeah, well, good for you. I mean, nobody wanted Sharia in your town anyway. But we've had a horrendous sort of poisonous algae growth surrounding Islamic law in the last 20 years as people say things about Islamic law that bear no relation to it, including Muslims. There are Muslims who really don't know anything about Islamic law, who will tell you about Islamic law anyway. My colleague who teaches about West Africa tells a story about a ruler who came to power somewhere in West Africa, and he said, following Islamic law, all property owned by women is now the property of their husbands. And then he fell from power sometime later, and his successor came along and saying, following Islamic law, all property that had previously been owned by women is now owned by women again. So you had diametrically different assertions as to what Islamic law was by people who were actually felt they were ruling according to Islamic law. So it's a very complicated business. And it's a business in which the usul, the principles on which the law is based, are very, very important. So that you will have one madhab, one philosophical school that will say Islamic law is based on the Quran and secondarily on the Hadith, but not on the Hadith if it violates other principles like the public weal or even the opinion of a judge. You have one school of law that maintain that the only laws in Islam are those that are in the Quran. And on everything else, we don't have anything that is definitive. We have information, but it's not necessarily probative. And so these diversions from one to another became very serious. At a later point, I'll be talking about urban politics because I know too much about them. In the 11th century in Iran, differences between adherents to one school of Islamic law and another school of Islamic law were so great that it amounted to a civil war. And the city that I studied for my doctoral work, the city of Nishapur, basically destroyed itself by Hanafis fighting against Shafis. Well, I'm not going to tell you right now who Hanafis were and who the Shafis were because they were simply two different schools of thought in Islamic law that are normally regarded as being very, very close together. And in fact, if you read any introduction to Islam, they'll say there are 4 schools of Islamic law. Each of the 4 regards the other 3 as legitimate. And this is in Sunni law. So you have Hanafis, Shafis, Hanbalis, and Malikis. These people fought each other viciously at one time. because the question of which school of law is going to prevail grabbed people's emotions and their social connections in ways that were extremely provocative, and we do not know why. I've been trying to dope out now for 50 years why the Hanafis and the Shafis fought each other. Because the schools of law just don't seem to be that big a deal to fight over. But they did, and in some way you have a parallel if you go into history of Christianity about the fights people would have over, is an image of a saint a legitimate thing or an illegitimate thing? Can men wear beards? This was a big deal in medieval Christianity. Can men wear beards? The Roman Church said, no, men cannot wear beards, and they would cite a certain verse in the Bible. The Eastern Orthodox Church mandated that the priests should all wear beards because, what did they cite? The same verse in the Bible. They did not agree on the reading of that particular verse. The Greeks were right and the Romans were wrong, but it appears that the early Roman Church thought that their bishops should look like Roman senators. And the senators were clean shaven. The generals had beards, the later emperors. But the senators are normally clean shaven. When you go to the Met and you look at the Roman things, most of the men are clean shaven. So they would disagree on that, to the extent of anathematizing one another and threatening all sorts of things, and then trying to impose their will on the laity. So that you had these Christian bishops saying, no lord should wear a beard. And they were unable to make it stick. And then they had the whole business all over again when it came to shaving the top of the head, a tonsure. The Irish Catholic Church shaved the front of the head, sort of like Japanese samurai. The Roman Church shaved the crown of the head, which on someone like me is very easy because there's no hair left on the crown of the head, and it appears that the Romans had a better grasp of male pattern baldness. But the fight between the Irish and the Irish Catholics and the Italian Catholics was vehement on this question of who has the correct tonsure. And then you look at the details and you say, well, how often did you have to shave the front or the crown of your head in order to be considered to be wearing a tonsure? And it appears that it's every 6 months. Well, that means you could have hair 3 inches long on the crown of your head and still be considered a monk wearing a tonsure, because your hair grows at about ½ an inch a month if you have hair. All this is really quite ridiculous, and I perhaps shouldn't use this as an example, but the thing is that it comes out of verses in the Bible, interpretation of verses in the Bible. So that if you're going to take the Quran and some Hadith as being, maybe not all Hadith, but some Hadith as being sources, then there's a question of the interpretation of the sources. And this is where you get into this business of qiyas, which is a kind of logic, which people did not apply in the same way, depending on which school they were from. There's been a great deal of study of the question of drinking alcohol, for example. And it's very clear that Muslims prohibit the drinking of alcohol, except by Americans visiting Saudi Arabia, where you will be offered more whiskey than you have ever dreamt of before, because the assumption is that Americans drink whiskey all the time, and you don't want your host to drink alone, etc. Anyway, somehow they all have whiskey, they just don't have it in public. If you go to Pakistan, you have to sign something saying that you were a alcoholic, then you get a permit saying you can buy alcohol. But if you're a non-Muslim, because there are no alcoholic Muslims. One of God's blessings. Well, Okay, the Quran says, do not drink grape wine, lest you go to your prayers intoxicated. Well, there's room for interpretation. It gives a reason. It says, do not drink grape wine, lest you go to your prayers intoxicated. Well, supposing I started drinking right after this prayer and then stopped long enough before the next prayer so I'm not intoxicated anymore. Maybe I can just squeeze in, half a dozen belts and drink anyway. And so there are schools of law that said that. Said, just don't go to your prayers drunk, but hey, otherwise, we're in Bosnia. What are we going to do? It's cold. So we drink. No offense to Bosnians in the class. But then you have someone else who would say, the Quran prohibits grape wine. There's not a word in the Quran or in the Hadith about whiskey or vodka or bira or other alcoholic beverages. Hey, God was looking away apparently, and all these other things must be permitted. So you have some Muslims who say that. And then some people will say, well, it says you can't drink a drop of wine. It doesn't actually say that. And therefore they flick a drop away and they drink. It is amazing how many variants came into being on the question of consuming alcohol, including the issue of, what about non-beverage alcohol? Like the alcohol that you put in perfumes in order to create the evaporation creating an aroma. So the question of, well, what's the consistency of the alcohol used, what's the density, so on and so forth. And then later on, in the 14th century, the question of whether the high you get from caffeine was a kind of intoxication, and therefore whether coffee should be included in the prohibition. And it was for a time. There was severe penalties, supposedly even the death penalty, though I don't know it was ever implied, for drinking coffee. And we have some reports saying people shifted from coffee to hashish in order to avoid violating the law. I'm not sure that actually occurred. But, okay, you have diversity of the law, and the diversity leads to violence. By 1200, you can see fairly clearly that 4 law schools are going to be legitimate, and they're all going to tolerate each other. And the other law schools disappear. So you have something that's akin to what happened with the Hadith, where you once had 100,000, now you're down to 20,000, and they're contained in a fixed set. So now you get to the 1200s, even more the 1300s, you have 4 schools of law. The other schools are more or less forgotten, and those 4 are considered mutually acceptable. And increasingly, one or another of the schools becomes particular to a certain geographical area. So that, let's say in 1150, you'll have book burning in Spain over disagreements on matters relating to law and theology. But and Spain is sort of like North Africa in that respect. The book burners really come from Morocco. But you go along another couple of hundred years, and everyone in Spain and Morocco follows the same law school. So what you have is a diversity of law and then another big crunch. So now you have Quran plus Sunnah plus Sharia. And whatever Islam is contained within those 3 more or less fixed entities of Quran, Sunnah, and Sharia. You can't say that in 1000. You can't even say that in 1100. But it's beginning to be true by 1200 that you have that. At that point, you begin to have a new expansion. And the new expansion is what I'm not going to try and talk about, but it is Sufism. And you start to have a spread of brotherhoods devoted to what's often called a mystic interpretation of Islam. And you had thousands of brotherhoods. 99% of those brotherhoods disappear in the course of the 18th and 19th and early 20th centuries. And the ones that are left form, in a sense, a new big crunch. In other words, enormous diversity, so you have a different set in Senegal, a different set in Egypt, a different set in Indonesia, and then they come together, and the way it comes together in this big crunch is that you have Quran plus Sunnah plus Sharia, and I'm not going to add in Sufism because that implies a mystic approach. What I'm going to say is that this is tariqah. The word tariqah, meaning a path or a way, is the word that applies to one of these Sufi brotherhoods, but I'm not applying it in this sort of macro sense to the content of the belief, or rather to the organization. Because what you have with the rise of Sufism, for the first time in Islam, is belonging to a specific religious organization. You never belonged to a law school. You observed the dictates of a particular law school, or you honored the arguments of the leader of a certain law school. But it wasn't a membership sort of thing, and it could be anywhere. You certainly did not belong to a school of Hadith, because there were no schools of Hadith. You simply had local variation. But with from the 1300s on, you could belong to specific organizations that were Muslim organizations, and that is what seems to be the final big crunch takeaway, is that Islam today, not everywhere or not with everybody, but it has a very strong influence related to organization and to a geographically linked organization. In other words, you could have a tariqah that would have a branch in Istanbul and a branch in Baghdad and a branch in New Delhi and a branch in Marrakesh. And they're all expressions of the same type of Sufism. Each one has a clubhouse, each one has a certain set of rituals that are proper to the organization. And each one has brethren who support and honor other brethren. Well, this, I would say, is what a tariqah is, and what survives from that era of Sufism is this idea of organizations. So that many of the organizations we have today, whether it's the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt or the Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, or wherever else it is, or a traditional Sufi brotherhood like the Qadiriyya in Indonesia. It's the organization that's common among these groups. And you don't have a parallel for this back in the early centuries of Islam. And it raises lots of questions about the source of authority, because there is an intrinsic conflict between belonging to a brotherhood, whether it's a mystic brotherhood or a political brotherhood, that believes in a ruler who is always the person to whom you owe allegiance, versus a belief that there is a political leader of a state to whom you owe allegiance. And this conflict between what's called parochial allegiances and state allegiances is central to issues involving Islam today, particularly when you have tariqas that are geographically widespread. I'd say one of the most interesting conflicts today is in Turkey. In Turkey you have a President Erdogan, who I don't want to characterize his rule, but he has built a palace with 600 rooms or more for himself in Ankara, which probably just shows he has a large family and is expecting a lot of guests. I don't know. But to be the contractor who built it must have been a very lucrative contract, and lucrative contracts seem to attach to him and his family. Okay, you have a powerful ruler in a major state who has developed a kind of fixation on his own personal rule. Then you have a religious organization of almost entirely of Turks. And instead of following Mr. Erdogan, they follow Mr. Gulen. Mr. Gulen lives in eastern Pennsylvania. He left Turkey, 15 years ago or so, because he had given a speech that people took issue with, and he decided he would exile himself rather than deal with these accusations. The Gulen organization, everything that Erdogan does, he does in Turkey. The Gulen organization is everywhere in the world. They have 1,000 schools, a whole bunch of universities, very much focused on education. Plus they have a enormous amount of money. Real devotees of the organization give 50% of their income to the organization. Originally, Mr. Gulen and Mr. Erdogan were very much on the same page. Now the Gulen organization feels that Erdogan has become a megalomaniac. That's their words, not mine. And he in turn thinks that they are a terrorist organization trying to take over the state. So they're trying to anathematize one another. But the interesting thing is that Erdogan is the head of a state, whereas Gulen is the head of a tariqa, essentially. It's an organization that you don't carry a card. It's not a formal membership organization. It's not a Sufi brotherhood. You don't have rituals together that the Sufis would have. But the Gulen people know who they are, and they work together. And they are powerfully opposed to Erdogan. They say Erdogan doesn't have the power to destroy them. Erdogan is going to try anyway. This is the sort of conflict you get in the nature of authority. Now, once you come together with tariqa, then you have the question of where do you go here in terms of the organization of Islam and the nature of authority in Islam, and that isn't a topic for me to talk about today. So let me go back to the beginning of this. This is the Big Bang, Big Crunch approach that tries to give a broad perspective on Islam as it developed over time. One final point I'd make about this approach is that in each of these instances, Islam seems to become divergent and then it comes back. Divergent and then it comes back. That, I think, is a singular aspect of Islam as a religion. The tendency to resist permanent division. Now, there is a permanent division between Sunni and Shia, although there have been times when they have tried to come together, and I think they are doing so now, although you wouldn't know it from reading the newspaper. The reason I say this is because the Organization for Islamic Cooperation has set up a committee to deal with law, and the committee recognizes 8 different legal approaches, including 2 of them are Shiite, 1 is Kharijite, and 5 of them are Sunni, because they have resurrected one of the non-existent schools of law and given it canonical status, and yet they still leave out another Shiite group, namely the Ismailis. So, there are people who think that it should all be brought together, but the important thing in my mind is that this idea of reining diversity in Islam in and bringing it back together is something that has recurred on a number of areas of focus in the history of Islam, and you cannot find quite the same thing in Christianity or Buddhism or religions that are arguably organized similarly to Islam as universal churches. So Islam has this track record of fragmenting and then coming together, and that is a very striking aspect, and is kind of an affirmation of the notion that I talked about at the very beginning of the course, that all Muslims belong to an ummah, to a single faith community. And the idea that the notion of being Muslims together will always reassert itself is distinctive about Islam. And it's one of the reasons why the Islamophobic tendencies of today gain a certain momentum from that. As I say, well, all Muslims are the same. Well, of course, they're not the same. They've never all been the same. But there is a recurrent tendency of Muslims to regard themselves as belonging to a single community instead of to a congeries of diverse communities, for example, the way Protestants do. Who can make sense of Protestantism? Or Buddhism. You don't want to get a Zen Buddhist and a Pure Land Buddhist and a Tantric Buddhist. Anyway, get them in the same room, they won't have a whole lot to talk about because there's a lot of differences. But in Islam, there's a lot of coming together. So this begins with Hadith, and with the Hadith, because it is canonical, because the 6 books were compiled, people have come to think that we know what Islam was like in the earliest period because we have the books of Hadith. We do have the books of Hadith, the canonical books, but we have to realize that there were tens of thousands of Hadith that were excluded from the canonical books. Some of them still in circulation. One of the most popular Hadith, for example, is the one that glorifies education, saying, "Seek knowledge even unto China." Oh, what a wonderful thought, particularly from a Chinese point of view. But it's not sahih. It isn't in the canonical books. Though you do have in the canonical books the hadith that talks about the donkey of the prophet hearing from his father, heard from his father, heard from his father, this donkey isnad. Well, everyone agrees that probably is untrue, and people think the China stuff sounds too good not to be true. So, as it works out, you really do come down to a lot of preferences when it comes to hadith. People say, well, some hadith are just cooler than other hadith. And who wants to know 20,000 of them anyway? So one of the interesting practices that you have in the medieval period, coming down really into early modern period, is that scholars who are knowledgeable in hadith will collect a Kitab al-Arba'in, a book of 40. That's a book where they put down, maybe on a specific subject or maybe in general, 40 hadith. And they will maybe they just have the hadith, or maybe they have some comments on it. But see, here's 40 hadith on jihad, or 40 hadith on freedom, or 40 hadith on such and such. And so many people are, when you read about their studies, say, well, he studied with so-and-so when he studied his Kitab al-Arba'in, his book of 40. We don't know what was in those 40, because everyone's book of 40 is different from somebody else's book of 40. But what it testifies to is a notion that even within this sort of sea of hadith that was segregated from the ocean of hadith that originally existed, you still have strong preferences for little pools of hadith that seem to be particularly appealing to particular individuals. So you have that down to the present day. And you get this, say in certain Salafi circles, they'll say, well, here's a set of hadith, a subset that are real Islam. But it's a subset of a much larger set, and somebody else could come up with a different subset. I've occasionally talked to Muslim scholars of my acquaintance and say, why don't you publish a Kitab al-Arba'in? Well, let us know. What are your favorite hadith? What are the 40 most beautiful hadith, the most enlightening hadith that you know, as a kind of antidote to the idea of letting the hadith be chosen by people whose objectives one may not esteem entirely. No one has yet taken me up on that suggestion, but this sea of hadith is a fundamental point in the growth of the Islam as a social community, because it is diverse and then it comes back together. And I will relate this to conversion, which I'm going to talk about on Thursday.